Hi everyone, and welcome to the pilot episode of Feedzai's RiskOps stories. With me here in the studio, I have Dan Holmes from Feedzai. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Rich. Good to be here.
Scams is very much the hot topic. In the last year, scams are now costing banks more than card fraud. I mean, that's a massive change in the industry. Can you talk us through how we got here?
If you rewind 4 or 5 years, account takeover or third-party compromise was the primary threat to industry. And as a result, the banks responded to that, right? So the banks brought in new technology, device recognition, behavioral biometrics, malware detection, location analytics, all to augment what they were already doing from a transaction monitoring perspective. And what that meant is that it gave the banks a really good opportunity to recognize third-party compromise. So it was pretty easy for me as the bank to say, this isn't Rich's usual device. His behaviour looks fundamentally different to what I expect to see from Rich, and the location that he's coming in from today is also very different. That's conducive for a good risk strategy around account takeover. Banks were able to get their detection levels up to 80-90%, so the fraudsters were failing far more frequently than they were succeeding. Fraudsters are a resourceful group. They go away and they think about, how do I give myself the advantage? The conclusion that they reached was that the frauds prevention ecosystem is no longer the weakest part of the chain. The weakest part of the chain is now the customer themselves. So they target the customer, and that's how scams becomes the prominent threat. And clearly now it's on the banks to respond and think about how do they get themselves back on the front foot.
You know, I've noticed this myself in the banks that I use. When I'm adding new payees or sending money to people that I've not interacted with previously, I'm now seeing quite a lot of additional noise and messages and clicks that I have to do to accept the fact that I'm either taking an additional risk in the transaction or that I'm acknowledging the fact that I'm sending money to a new payee and I understand the risk of a scam, etc., and I'm having to tick a box. Is that everything that the industry's doing, or is more happening behind the scenes?
So there's a lot more happening. If I'm in the bank's hot seat and I'm the one responsible for scam detection, I'm thinking about 3 things. Adoption of the right technology. That needs to be a combination of 2 things. It needs to be adopting new technology purpose-built for scam detection, but it also needs to be putting a different lens on your existing data capabilities to make sure that how you're looking at that data and how you're utilising that tool allows you to stop scams as well as the historic fraud typologies. Secondly, it's about data consolidation and making sure that you're utilising those data capabilities in the right way. What we often see through speaking to banks is that you've got 4 or 5 point solutions or islands of fraud tools and they're not interacting with one another. You need to make sure that you're not just taking insights from 4 products individually or 4 data sources individually. You're driving them together in the way that allows you to get the most out of that data. And then thirdly, it's education awareness. If you think back through the last 3 or 4 years, education and awareness in a mobile app or on an online banking platform was hidden away in the corner. You had to actively go looking for it. Whereas to your point now, banks are actively bringing that back in to the session. So education and awareness has got to take on a whole new meaning. It's got to be real time, it's got to be dynamic, and it's got to be presented at the moment of risk. Typically, when you think about the profile of a scam victim, you might think about an older, perhaps more vulnerable customer. Data shows us that it's not just the older, more vulnerable customers that are likely to fall for a scam. We've seen younger generations, we've seen middle-aged generations, we've seen extremely intellectual professionals all fall for modern, sophisticated scams. And your education and awareness strategy has got to reflect that. You've got to appeal to all levels of consumer, both in channel at the right time, but also engaging through platforms that banks have typically avoided in the past. We've seen TV adverts on primetime TV slots. We've heard radio adverts. We've seen banks start to engage with younger customers through YouTube and other social media platforms.
I noticed through the pandemic, you've seen an entire generation of customers suddenly become native digital bankers. What are the vectors and the challenges that are happening to the other demographics out there?
What it's done is it's enabled them to consume their bank's services more easily. But as more people have come online, what that's done is it's widened the risk exposure for the banks. What the data analysis shows, the younger population are almost as vulnerable as the older population. You almost end up with a bathtub type view on
curve,
that.
yeah.
Exactly. You're hypothesizing around why this is. My personal opinion on this is that they've come through in a generation where it's just more normal to interact and share data and share stories online. And the scams reflect that as well. No longer do scams take form of bogus lottery wins like you might have assumed 10 or 15 years ago. They often play on what we call fear or reward. So fear of my accounts are at risk and I need to secure my accounts now and move money to a so-called safe account.
We've seen that with the your account has been compromised type approach.
They often play on current events, whether that be economic turmoil, whether that be COVID-19. We've heard examples of, I call you and say, hey Rich, I'm from your bank. There's a transaction to Apple in the last 20 minutes for $1,000. Was this you? You say no. I say, right, okay, what we need to do is secure your accounts. I've set you up a safe account over here. Please transfer all your funds in there while we investigate this suspicious transaction. transaction, you unwittingly go ahead and do that. But often what will happen before you commit to making that transaction is you almost want a sense of validation that you are speaking to the right person. And some examples of how we've seen the fraudsters tackle that is that they'll say, Rich, look, I know I've called you out of the blue, let me give you some comfort. Call the number on the back of your card, make sure that you're speaking to the bank, let me give you that confidence, then we'll proceed with the conversation. I can quite easily leave the line open so that when you dial back, I'm still on the other end of the phone. And what we've also seen is I could play a false IVR. I could give you options of press 4 because you've received a call relating to fraud. It just creates that extra level of assurance from your perspective. And even things like when you do connect back to me, I might give you to somebody else and say, oh, we're speaking to this guy, Dan, can you connect me back to him? And they'll do that. And there'll be call center noises playing in the background. Scams are sophisticated. As you mentioned at the start that scams have cost the UK industry more than card fraud for the first time ever. This isn't just a UK problem, this is a global problem. We're hearing from banks in APAC who are experiencing this challenge, North America. This is a challenge that's truly global, and what I'd also love to see more of is dialogue between banks in different parts of the world, sharing experience around the learnings that they've taken away in this space and how we can almost create a global ecosystem when it comes to sharing best practice.
This is going to be a big US problem. It is already a big problem in APAC, so getting ahead of the curve, getting tools in place and solutions in place to be able to combat this is going to be critical. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.